Welcome to the latest episode of the Undiscovered Metric. I'm Jessica Cardonick, VP of Product Marketing at Adverity, and I'm excited to be joined by Mariama Kamanda, Data and Analytics Senior Manager at the Barilla Group. Today, we're going to be talking about coupling data with creativity and really being creative with data and leveraging it to achieve optimal campaign performance. So with that, let's go ahead and get things kicked off. Mariama, thanks again for joining. We really appreciate you being here. My first question is around, like I said, data and creativity. Many CMOs say that data hinders creativity, but there are really ways to be creative using data. And I'd be curious of how do you blend marketing creativity with data analysis?
That's a really great question. Thank you so much for having me, Jessica. It's so nice to have this conversation. So yes, CMOs typically do have, some sort of hesitancy towards data and creativity. But at Barilla, and I know some of the other big organizations are really leaning into that insight piece. So it's really that bit that comes right at the end of everything that's very unsexy about data. We gather it, we wrangle it, but then eventually it is going to turn into an insight to really help, CMOs and marketing teams optimize on campaign performance and really optimize on even the idea generation of assets. So there is kind of a coupling and there's definitely a change that's coming. But when it comes to data, the really dirty bit at the beginning, I think there's always some level of maybe misalignment and misunderstanding because they think you're going to come in and strip all of it out. But I think it's really how you change that data into something so actionable and so something like a so what ultimately. So I think that's really where the industry is at the moment, and that's where most companies are moving to.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful. How would you say that you can make creativity and performance work without sacrificing one over the other?
To not sacrifice the creativity. I mean, I sit in the data team and our job is really to ensure that we're the partners of the business, partners of marketers. So we all have to have very good processes. You have to have trust, and there needs to be a level of understanding as well. Because oftentimes when you have data people, we're very good at coming in and throwing all the data at you. And to be honest, that's not what creatives and people want to see. They want to understand how very tangibly are you going to help us impact the bottom line? How are you going to help us grow things like equity, which are very important when you come to any sort of CPG and any sort of brand. So I think at the core of that, like I said, it's the process and there's an understanding and there's taking people on that journey. Otherwise, it becomes increasingly difficult when you start talking about things like this metric isn't working from a media perspective. This marketing ROI isn't working because of X, Y, and Z. There's already going to be a barrier there. So there needs to be, first of all, trust, understanding, and then there needs to be some sort of change in the company. And if you're going on that change already around the insights, it makes it a bit easier.
That's really insightful. What would you say are the combinations of data that you're looking at to determine performance? Can you also get creative with the data itself to fuel decision making?
Yes, for sure. So the types of data that we are typically looking at, and I think are very invaluable when it comes to, really gauging performance. You've got the media side of things. So in marketing, you can have different sorts of campaigns that you do. You have the ones that happen digitally, you have the ones that happen natively, you've got top and bottom funnel, and you'll have very different KPIs and different ways of measuring the success. But ultimately, they're all bundled into that beautiful thing we call market data. So let me take a concrete example. If you're doing media, media is one of the easiest things to look at because it also, to some extent, you can have attribution depending on which part of the top or bottom funnel you're going for. So we look at media efficiency metrics, which are very specific typically to agency partners, so CPM. And then you have things about how good your assets actually are. So you've got things like the view through rate if you're creating videos. If you want to look at engagement, if you're building a good community, look at sentiment, you can look at the comments as well and do some scraping on that. So that's from a very media perspective if you're looking at how good a campaign is. But when you look at things like an MMROI, which is the very concrete part of that attribution piece, because what is very key is you create something beautiful, we want to measure it, but also we want to ensure that we understand how it impacts the business's bottom line, because creativity is a huge chunk of that. There was a study done by Nielsen, I believe they've replicated it a few times now, and they've shown that creativity, which is the assets that are made, the campaigns that are done, they account for something like 45% of sales revenue uplift, which is massive. So to get that kind of data outside of the media and individual campaign measurement, you can work with partners like Ipsos. You can leverage things like a platform that checks the creative readiness of your assets. You can work with Kantar, and they'll be able to give you a gauge of how good your asset is using some level of behavioral science or using survey data. Or you can use something that even uses some generative AI to tell you how a human's eye might move across an asset. If you can create a data set, it's going to be quite rich, granted. If you can get all of that data together, you can then put it in something like an MMM. So you can put it against traditional marketing levers like temporary price reductions. You can put it against marketing levers, media levers. You can put it against cannibalization, seasonality. And then you've got creativity to really help explain what's really driving your marketing, what's really driving the uplift sales and revenue as well.
That was going to be my next question around MMM and really how do you combine all of that into your MMM and then also around kind of the real-time activation strategy around that. So maybe you could just shed a little bit more light if you've got any other insight there.
No, of course. So I started talking about MMMs and got very overzealous about it. So do bear with me. When you talk about MMMs, I think hopefully most people know what they are, but in a nutshell, it's just a way to measure how marketing is impacting the bottom line. And within an MMM, you have several different levers you can look at, as I've just described. So you've got media levers, so anything that has paid behind it. And that can be anything from, your TV, your out of home, digital out of home. You've got things like temporary price reduction. So that's very much to do with the shopper marketing experience within a retailer. You've got things like cannibalization. So in our brand, we might have several brands that serve a similar purpose. Let's take biscuits. We might have several different biscuit brands and they're all on the same shelf. And sometimes we cannibalize. I mean, it's something that happens with most, Nestle probably, and any of the other big brands. And then finally, we can do things like seasonality to understand what are the nuances or what are the big things that are happening. And all of these things act as levers to really explain how you can contribute to the bottom line or sales revenue uplift. One of those levers that you can look at is creativity. So, like I said earlier, creativity accounts for 49% of why someone buys your product. And that makes sense. If I see a beautiful piece of packaging or I see a beautiful asset and I keep getting hit with it, it's going to almost become very top of mind and very salient. Therefore, I'm going to purchase it. I mean, it's happened to me a few times. I'll see a beautiful packet and I try it and I'm like, it wasn't quite for me, but they've already converted me because they've been talking to me through the creative. So once you've got all those levers, the next lever down is to understand how can you really play with them? Because we've got all that data now gathered, we've got it, in a model, and it's telling us, rightfully or wrongfully, or depending on how good you are at your marketing strat, creative accounts now for 30% of your sales revenue uplift. What does that mean? It's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing, but you'll need to look a level deeper within that kind of lever. So that would mean if you've got a good partner and you've got good granularity of data, you can check things like, was my asset ready for the platform it was intended? So for instance, let's take everything that's happening with social media recently. Only a few years ago, Instagram Meta decided to go more full screen. So they started to do 9:16 asset to give you a full screen experience to follow from TikTok. But let's say you've created an asset that was cut down from television and now it's intended for a mobile phone on Instagram. That experience generally is going to be poor. When I'm going through my phone, I don't know about you, Jessica, if you've got an Instagram, I have no intention of watching a 30-second ad on my phone. I need it to be about 3 seconds at most. You need to show me a logo. You need to give me a hook. It needs to resonate with me ever so slightly. So you can have a platform and you can have some creative data that tells you whether the asset was actually intended for the platform. Was it good enough to be on the platform? Does it justify why that creativity lever that accounts for 30% of your sales uplift is so low? So that's just one example of the kind of creative data. The other ones are, does it have the right sorts of markers on it? Do you have your logo, which increases, brand recognition? Does it have a good mood? Are you creating a very depressing ad? I mean, sometimes you have to, but are you creating something that fulfills a purpose? And you can have that kind of data coming through, and you can do that through survey data, like I said, or you can find really good partners these days that use things like generative AI, machine learning to predict how the brain would respond to an asset. And you can get that data at like a very meta level and mass. And that way you can at least say to your business from an actionable standpoint, we've done an MMM, We figured out that creative accounts for 30% of our uplift, which is quite big, but there are optimizations within this that we can make to impact our return on investment. So don't put TV assets on your mobile phone. Only create assets that are 5 seconds long, not 30 seconds long, because people aren't watching them. Or you can say things like, you need to put your logo all over it. Otherwise, people aren't even going to recognize that you're creating an asset for them and it's not from your brand.
That's super insightful and definitely a huge value to the marketing team. When it comes to MMM, how do you then deep dive into sort of the different levels to get a broad understanding of all the metrics? So, for example, like media, creative, trade price reductions, things like that.
It's actually a combination of partners, people internally, and then specialists. We're
Okay.
very lucky at Barilla because we have great partners and they're very patient with us and they really assist us in getting the right data in the right format. And then we've got specialists who can really help you drill down and explain the metrics because from a data perspective, usually what we want to do is apply that data science. We want to have robust models and we want them to be predictive. But the reality is that we definitely need to lean on marketing teams to give us that broader context. And we also need our media teams to ensure that they can give us context so we can build out a broader so what, like I was mentioning at the beginning, which is the insight. So with our partners, we ask them to give us whatever data they have within reason. So for instance, when you think about sales data, most people go to Kantar or Nielsen. So you need to have a good proposition in place and you need to know the sorts of data that you need. For media, in a typical MMM, you're probably going to need spend data and impression data. Now, the journey that we've been on has been difficult to get most of that data in-house, but we've managed to do it successfully. And we've managed to use Adverity actually as a partner to help us during that journey to pipe a lot of digital pipelines into our own systems. And now we can access that data. And the process it's been quite good. It's taken a couple of years, but we've gotten to a good point where we have brilliant coverage of all of our media touch points from a digital standpoint. When it comes to creative data, as mentioned already, we need a very systematic way of working because not everyone is going to test all creative assets all the time, but we need to figure out a way to get that done, and our partners help us do that.
That's really helpful. Actually, one of the things I was thinking about is really the partnership that you have with the marketing team and as an analytics and insights team, I guess, how do you then work with marketing to present and share the metrics to be acted upon? How is that relationship? Is it really up to them to then take what you're providing and then acting on it, or you guys really work in partnership to come up with the strategies? I would love to better understand that.
No, that's a great question because usually there is a bit of, like I said, back and forth when it comes to data, as well as marketing teams, because we come in and we're not as fun typically. And we don't usually speak the language as well as they do. And it can seem like we're going to mark your homework, and that is something we really want to avoid. So within Barilla, what we want to do is be a data-driven company. So luckily for us, that's something that's come all the way from the top. So it's almost a mandate and a challenge to the company to be more data-driven. So we have even more responsibility now. But within our team, the way that we see it, irrespective of having a mandate, we want to be the partners for the marketers. We want to go on the journey with them. And that's not just in word, we want to go with actions as well. So within the data function, I sit within a broader team. So we've got a data team as well as an insight team, and we've got some AI specialists as well. And what we want to do is come together as like a trifecta to give everything you need, from having the data in a good format, having the governance around it, and then telling stories. And that's where the insight and the so what plays a really big part. And when I say so what, that's the recommendation. Because as I was describing MMM just now to you, we're going to do the modeling, we're going to create a deck, and it's going to be quite number heavy. But the reality is we need to really ensure that's ready for the business. So what are the insights? What is the context that has given shape to those numbers? And then what's the so what? What action can the business reasonably take? So for the most part, we'll do the first run through within my team, and we are very well embedded in the business. But then we need to also speak to our stakeholders. We need to speak to marketing to say, this is what we've observed from a very objective level. What do you guys think? Is there anything that we're missing? Is there more data you have? Is there more context that you have? Because what we found, or what I found even when I was working at an agency, when you present numbers that are quite stone cold, even if you think you've got the context and you stand the business, there becomes some sort of defensiveness because it feels like I said, you're marking homework. So it's almost giving the business a chance when you present to them, asking them back, this is what we found. This is using your data. This is using our context as a company. But is there anything that we're missing? Is there anything else we could have added? And that's where the partnership comes in. That's how we start building a very robust strategy, very robust actions after one campaign, very robust yearly strategies as to how to activate with media or how to optimize things like the creative. So it needs to be the trust. So if I were to say, we have it there, that it's always something that you need to keep working on and you need to keep talking about as you move on.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that that would be a huge priority because ultimately you want the same things, right? Both teams want to see success and positive results. And by your team kind of shining a light into areas where there might not be, they might not be kind of moving the needle enough, I can see how that can be difficult and something that you definitely need to continue to work towards. Speaking of challenges, what challenges do you currently see for the data teams on a large scale? And how has the overall buzz around AI impacted kind of your daily operations and planning, et cetera?
I mean, that's a great question. For data teams at the moment, I think it's business as usual. Data scientist, it's a very transferable skill. When I started 10 years ago, it was, data analyst, and then it swiftly became data scientist. Then you had research data scientists, and now you have AI scientists. The reality is that they're all built off very similar things. It's maths and statistics, and they just have different packaging, and you always have to evolve. So for the people who work in data itself, we're always going to be getting new skills, learning new things just by the nature of it. So for us, not too much of an impact. On businesses, it's how they leverage it. Luckily for us at Barilla, we do have a strategy in place on how much AI we want to use because we want to do fewer, bigger, better. And we want it to be as actionable as possible because there's nothing worse than being like a child in a sweet shop and wanting to try everything and then they launch something else and you want to try it. So the way we look at AI and the way we're looking at data is how can it optimize processes? Where are the best places that we can tweak that will add maximum value for the company? Otherwise, you're going to find yourself looking and chasing the new thing constantly, and that's not going to be beneficial to the business because there's a process, there's a workflow, there's the investment, there's the understanding, there's the uptake, and there's the change management to take place. But if you take something like a real-time measurement dashboard or something like a marketing mix, there are ways that you can optimize that process using AI. And that could just be generating insights from the numerical data. That's already an optimized process. You'd have taken something that would have taken 7 days down to 3 days. And those are the micro kind of things that you can be doing as opposed to anything big and sexy. And I think oftentimes what I'm seeing with some companies, and I think some of them are gauging and feeling the land at the moment, is they want to try things, they want to experiment, but fewer, bigger, better is probably the way to go and optimize processes along the way that are meaningful to the people within the company, essentially.
I think you put that really nicely because I could see how it could sort of detract from what you're really trying to achieve and kind of get you off course in terms of and really focusing on kind of the optimization, the efficiency gains, those sorts of things as really being kind of the winner in terms of how you implement AI. My last question, I know we're almost out of time. What advice would you give someone starting off in the data world? What sources, do you look at for key information, industry knowledge, et cetera?
I would say it's a piece of advice first. I'd say don't feel like any question is too silly and always feel okay to reach out to people. So even when you get your first data job, even when you're looking, for a data job, reach out to people on LinkedIn, reach out to people in your network because data people, there's one thing that we're going to do, and it's we're going to want to talk to you about data as much as we can. So don't be afraid to put yourself out there. I think that's the first, stepping stone. When it comes to resources, so when I first started my career and I used to live day and night just coding, I lived on Stack Overflow. So that's one of my favorite resources to always go to. The community there is very broad. You've got ample questions that have been asked. So if you ever have a question about coding, about an algorithm, about an optimization to make on Python, PySpark, Scala, SQL, you'll most likely find that someone has had a late night there and they would have written an answer to it. I'd say figure out if you want to do any hackathons. There's DataKind, I believe, in London. I'm not too sure if they've expanded outwards, and you can go to those kind of communities and do some, data for good for charities pro bono. And also check GitHub. GitHub is fantastic for just repos of beautiful code. I like to call code beautiful because sometimes it can be. And as opposed to you spending your hours trying to figure it out from scratch and being slightly stressed, you can definitely just find it, see if you can replicate it, and see how you can optimize.
That's great. That's really great insight and really appreciate your thoughts there. I think we're out of time, but really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. I think our audience will find some really insightful ideas and thoughts around creativity when it comes to data. And really, yeah, thanks again, Mariama.
No, thank you so much. It was lovely to meet you and have this chance. It was really great.